Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 4 of the RPM Rundown podcast. I'm your host for today's episode, Andrew Kmita. If you've listened to our podcast before, get ready for a good one today. Much like usual, we are going to talk through many current events and other important topics that are affecting the logistics industry directly. Joining me today, as usual, is another very special guest here from RPM's headquarters in Royal Oak, Michigan. Joining me today is Jon Garity, Vice President of Strategic Accounts. Welcome, Jon.
Thank you, Andrew. Appreciate it. Glad to be here. Looking forward. I've watched the first 3 episodes and excited to be part of the show.
Well, there you go. If you've watched the first couple, you know exactly what we are going to do today. And the reason you're here, obviously, is the amount of insight and the tenure you have with the organization. And I'm really excited for you to share some of that with our audience today as well.
Yeah. Well, looking forward to it.
Definitely. So for those who maybe aren't too up to speed as to how RPM labels certain positions and to the responsibilities that are required, all I know is that we have accounts and then we have strategic accounts. And obviously you're over that silo right there. So before we get started, if you can just take a minute, maybe introduce yourself and tell everyone a little bit about what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, Jon Garity, I was thinking about, I thought you might ask me that question.
Glad you prepared.
I was thinking about, well, I don't know if I'm prepared or not, but I thought you might ask it. I was thinking about that. So I started in this business in 1995. So I've been around. This next year will be officially 30 years, which is insane for me to think about, but it has been that long of a time since I've been in logistics. Been in part of brokerage, been in the expedite space for 20 years, and then I joined RPM in 2019, and always been involved in the automotive space, whether it be from a finished vehicle side at RPM and on the freight side as well, but mostly on the inbound side for the majority of my career, moving expedited parts to the factories, stock transfers, just supporting them in many different fashions. So today my role, VP of Strategic Accounts, involves really working with our highest profile customers, the volume based customers that can, where we have to look strategically to support their network, and that's my responsibilities. And I have a small team that supports them operationally, and from there we just make sure we're taking care of every need.
It's definitely important. And 30 years is a long time, really, in any industry. So if you were to go ahead and say, take the experience you have, I'm sure you've seen a couple things in the time that you've been in the industry. What would you say those, as you mentioned, high profile customers, what is it they're really looking for in a partner? And what are some of the things that you think have kept them within RPM's portfolio over all these years?
That's a great question. That's a great question. One, they're obviously looking for, the two major things they're looking for is cost and service, right? That's always going to be prominent within a large account that has to watch what they're spending in logistics and their network. What I believe RPM has brought to the table is not only transparency, but really transparency and also access to data. So, what we can provide to them from a visibility standpoint is unmatched, especially as we get a larger piece of the pie, so to speak. The more they spend with us, the more visibility we can give them, and the more access we can give them to what might be driving some costs within their network that they're not aware of. So it really comes down to trust, building rapport with these accounts, and ultimately just giving them, do what you say you're going to do, and then provide feedback on that so they can have information to make decisions off of.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I appreciate you sharing that. And, the one word that I heard you mention that I don't think it's discussed enough in this industry specifically is transparency. Yeah. I think it's something everybody wants, but in many cases is very difficult to find, depending on, of course, who your partner is and the type of data that's available. And actually, I think that's a great segue to kind of just jump right into some of the topics that at least I had front of mind today. Because when we talk about transparency, one of the big things out there in the brokerage space specifically, or the non-asset based side, and oftentimes if you're working with a non-asset based carrier, sometimes there's that question of, who is actually physically moving my freight? And how do I know that they're going to do a good job? And how do we make sure that they check all the boxes? Because recently I had just seen an article on FreightWaves that was actually talking about freight being held hostage by I guess we'll call it a phantom carrier out of Illinois that had kind of concocted a pretty ingenious plan to go ahead and nab 36 truckloads full of merchandise and trying to hold those ransom. I'm assuming you've heard about that as well.
I've caught wind of that as well. And that's, it's something I've talked about before on actually another podcast that we did that I talked about you have a lot of bad actors in the space. And what happened during COVID, everyone saw the rates skyrocket up, and a lot of trucking companies or a lot of people got into the business, and basically they jumped into the business to take advantage of the market. And, now the market has softened over the last 16 to 18 months. The market's been fairly soft. And these players, there are a lot of players out there that are intentionally, double brokering freight. Maybe they're not, fulfilling all of their maintenance responsibilities. A lot of things that happen there, but the fraud is a major, major concern for a lot of our large shippers. And simply put, you don't know today, when there's so many bad actors out there, what's happening with your freight. But there are a lot of tools that you can really mitigate that risk. I don't know if you can remove it entirely, but we use, a couple different platforms that we work with. I mean, I would say, and I don't want to plug RPM, but I'm going to plug RPM. I guess I'm in sales, so I get the opportunity to do that. We use 3 different providers that, 3 different, we use Carrier Sure, which helps us, vet our carriers. We use Highway, which is another vetting process that we work with. And then Triumph Pay, which Triumph Pay works with Highway and other providers, and they will actually look at the actual invoices, the amount of revenue a carrier is billing, does that correlate with the fleet size that they have? And, we do, RPM, we have a large carrier network, but we also have a very large customer base. And for me to say that we don't work with carriers that aren't, actively in our network today, we're always developing new carriers to support our customers. And you have to do that in a very responsible manner.
I would 100% agree. And, there really is a difference. I would say it's not exactly apples to apples when it comes to how you can vet a carrier and how you can vet I should say a team of carriers. And I'll give you an example. I had a prospect that I was speaking with through email just yesterday, and his response to me when I had inquired kind of on his network was, "Nope, I'm good. I go ahead and I use filters in Central Dispatch through Central Dispatch, and it usually works out okay." And I'm like, "What do you mean usually?
Yeah.
Usually isn't all the time." And the thing is that there is such a robust suite of technology out there that can be available that companies like ours will use to go ahead and make sure there's a really high quality carrier base. But at the same time, for every company like RPM that takes the time, that makes the capital investment to ensure that we have a strong network of carriers, there's also at least one that doesn't. Yeah. So if you're a customer out there, knowing you have freight to move, knowing that you need a long-standing, consistent partner, how do you tell the difference between someone who does and someone who doesn't? Like, what questions would you even ask?
Yeah, no, that's an incredible question. And I completely, understand that's what customers should be asking is, how do I know the difference between a broker that's doing things the right way and a broker that's cutting corners, so to speak? And really what you have to do your homework. You can get references on those brokers. You can actually go out and visit them. I mean, we invite customers here at RPM all the time because I want to showcase our facility and I want to, show them that we're a legitimate broker. Because last time I read, I believe there was over 1,000 registered brokers in the United States. And I think it's actually more than that. But, we're in the top 50, I believe we're ranked for Transport Tops in the top 50. And that's where there's a lot of guys that, work out of there. And I'm not knocking, but there's a lot of them that do an incredible job. But there are a lot of guys that cut corners. And I remember I get on a lot of these Facebook posts and these different forums that I just like to hear driver perspective and how different people deal with things. And I remember reading one of those forums or one of those threads, and they were asking on what do I do? The truck is broken down, and now the customer's saying they're not going to pay me for the shipment. What do I do with, and they're inviting people to join the conversation, which I don't know why you would, but they were. And they were talking about just walking away from the business, just leave the truck, without providing any solution to either the carrier that's stuck with the freight or the customer that needs to move the freight, and they were just going to walk away from it. And that's where you get, these small brokers that don't have the facilities, that don't have the capabilities to do what we do. But I suggest you ask those questions. What you just asked me, ask the broker you're working with. How do you vet your carriers? What tools do you use to ensure there is no fraudulent broker or carriers being put on shipments? How do you prevent double brokering? And there's a lot of things that we do that we can showcase to you and show you exactly how we do that. Whether we look at the number of trucks and how many inspections they have per year, inspections, and are they passing these inspections? And we catch it all the time. I mean, I can tell you how many times I work specifically with some high value product customers, and there are a lot of times I catch a shipment, or our team catches a shipment that could potentially be a carrier trying to get approved, and we say, no, you just don't meet our qualifications.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's definitely a full-time job keeping up on all that. That's for sure. And that's the thing, is we talk about the transparency aspect, but it's also the accountability aspect too.
Yeah.
It's one thing to go ahead and be able to vet carriers, but it's another one to make sure that you hold them accountable to the standards in which they work. And I think those two things really stand hand in hand. But I think that's a great question too. Ask those questions to your partner, right? Ask for more info, because especially the ones that have good intentions will be more than happy to go ahead and open up about it. I mean, for those that, let's say are watching this podcast here today or have seen others in the past, they might think that RPM exists within this room that we rented from a WeWork and we come in here once a month and do this thing, but it's not. We have a building that's 4 floors tall with 250 employees working in it, and we love to showcase that and show that off when people are in the area and are willing to stop by for a visit. It's important to us, and there's those high value investments, much like you talk about with our vetting software, that companies like ourselves want to show off and want to tell you about. So it shouldn't be a secret if you ask.
100%. Yeah, no, to your point, one of our differentiators is our size. And I think our size, we compete with the big box brokers. We absolutely compete with them from a pricing standpoint. I think we beat them handily from a service standpoint, but we are the right size. We have that flexibility in our model, but we have the size and the breadth to provide solutions. And anytime we can bring someone through here, but people don't love to meet anymore. People like they're all working remote. Right? I grew up in where I was in front of customers 15 times a week, calling on them face to face. And now it's a luxury when we have that opportunity to get in front of a customer and sit down with them and talk about their network, or bring them into our office and showcase, kind of what we bring to the table. But once they see it, they're like, wow,
oh, sure,
you guys are, legitimate, and this is something that we want to be a part of.
Well, and that's really that credibility, and I think that trust and that respect that gets built over time as you have a relationship with a high-value customer. And for instance, I have one of my high-value customers that I just love working with all of them dearly. They're great people. They're a lot of fun, and it's one of those synergies where their expectations and our capabilities just mesh really, really well.
Yeah.
And I got an email from them today, and it said, hey, I need a spot quote on this unit. It was left behind at an auction and needs to go to another auction. Long story short, another transporter dropped the ball and we need this done ASAP. And it was really nice to be able to know that I can go into our vetted carrier base. I can find somebody who can get that taken care of right now. And we had a truck dispatched within 20 minutes.
Yeah.
And that's that level of service and that level of confidence that we want our customers to have, to know that they can rely on us for situations and to be able to follow through when they have demands like that.
100%. Yeah. And those are situations that happen, and those are where you can make yourself, kind of make inroads with the customer when you can come through for them in a pinch.
From raw materials to production to finished products, most everything in our lives has traveled on a truck. RPM's extensive experience with shipping freight gives us the strategic advantage you're looking for when building lanes and shipping products both safely and on time. Our specialized network gives us the capacity to move automotive, aerospace, and consumer manufacturing goods within any point of the product lifecycle. If you're looking for tailored solutions within your operational structure, contact RPM today by visiting rpmmoves.com/contact. Now back to the show. So John, while we're on the topic of talking about trust, capability, I think those are things that actually are going to become more prevalent and more important as we move into the future here. I have an article that I had recently seen, again, on FreightWaves, because it seems like they have every useful article when it comes to freight lately, which is really great. Again, we talk about transparency. It's awesome, the insights that they're giving. But it was actually talking about the decline in rail transport and how over a 10-year period, there had actually been a 28% decline in overall rail usage. So the expectation, at least for me, is that all that freight has to go somewhere. And right now, and at least going into the future, it'll probably be over the road.
Some of it definitely will go over the road. I think there's a lot of different reasons for that. I know they're making investments in the rail to try and make it a more robust network so they can take on more freight or moving more commodities. But you've seen in 2000, I believe 21 and into 22, you had issues at the port, and a lot of that port congestion was causing shippers to move around, the port of, the West Coast ports and possibly bring the freight into East Coast ports. And when you're doing that, you're now a lot closer to your consumer, and you're not necessarily using rail as your solution to move the product to the end user. I think that there's probably some challenging environment for them now today. And overall, the freight market's also down, of course, but it's nowhere near down as 28%. I think you mentioned, over the last 10 years, which seems like a number that is
should be inverse. You would
think.
think.
You would think that it grew at some point.
Yeah.
But the freight market has also seen a downturn over the last 18 months, and I think a lot of that is due to everyone during, again, going back. I hate to even bring up the pandemic, but people were consumer spending was through the roof. I mean, and consumer spending even before then was always one of the economic indicators that always remained strong. Consumer index was always high. Consumer spending sustained our our economy for many years, and now you're seeing that slow down, pretty rapidly with inflation.
Oh, sure.
So I think that's going to make it even harder for the rail volumes to come back. But ultimately, a lot has changed in the network, especially with, you mentioned Mexico. The Mexico. I remember when I was talking to a supplier. This is probably, and I hate to say it, but it's probably 12 years ago. And they were telling me that, we had 3 plants we worked with domestically, and they were saying all 3 plants were moving to Mexico. And that's just where it's been now. Where back in the day,
Sure.
the only one I think that manufactured vehicles in Mexico was Volkswagen with the Bug, or the Beetle, I think it is. And so now, there's, I think, 8 OEMs that are manufacturing in Mexico and producing, where they used to produce small cars. Now they're producing SUVs and larger vehicles as well, which, of course, is creating more demand crossing the border. But going back to your original question on the rail, I mean, I think it's the rail has to make the investments in the right areas to compete with over the road. And right now, I don't know that the investments are being made.
Well, and
think
it's
that's what
also
they're trying to push.
Absolutely. And I'd say it's a sense as well where in the time it takes to, let's say, repair a road or a bridge is in a lot of cases a lot faster than the level of manpower, planning, and investment it takes to repair rail lines as well.
Yeah.
Because our infrastructure is rather old and it's aging rather rapidly. And especially when you look at, as you mentioned, all the nearshoring efforts over in Mexico, I don't think a lot of people out there really realize how strategic and how robust of a trade partner Mexico really is for the United States.
Yep.
We're actually, the United States is Mexico's #1 exporter.
Yeah.
3.3 million vehicles were produced in Mexico and sent into the United States just last year. And that's coming from a lot of domestic manufacturers.
Yeah.
And a lot of them are strategic in terms of the supply chain as well. Like, for instance, if you look at, Stellantis, there's the Saltillo engine plant. I know Ford had a plethora of models that was made down there, and it's very it's a very strategic move, even with BYD moving in. Again, there had been the outward promise that those vehicles would not be sold in the United States and that those are made just for Latin America. But again, being located so close to the U.S. border would lead one to believe they could easily integrate into the current infrastructure and that network. But that flexibility, I think, of kind of last mile and first mile transport and sometimes using over the road as a viable option to rail, I think is really something we're going to see going forward. More than anything, I think that's really evidenced by the fact that the House just passed a bill that was looking to invest $200 million in safer sleeping spaces and parking spaces for over-the-road truckers.
Yeah, I think that's part of a much bigger bill, but $200 million is being allocated specifically towards, truck parking, which is something no one ever thinks about. And I actually think about this because one of a peer of mine, I don't know, John Elliott, who's the founder of Load One, and he's very involved in the transportation space, and I would say he's very knowledgeable in this area. I was listening to his podcast only a month ago, and it makes you think. You forget that these drivers, they're forced to park right on these on and off ramps. If you drive late at night, you'll pass an on ramp and you'll see trucks backed up all the way from the the start of the ramp all the way onto the road, sometimes even a half mile down the road. And think how dangerous that is for those drivers and also for, the passerbys. So that's something that needs to be addressed. These drivers need safer areas to park. And personally, I look at it that, we should be providing that for them. Our drivers should be, have that at a minimum, be able to park safely and get their rest in. And the other thing, and part of that too, is, we look at the theft activity that's going on. Everyone's concerned with theft today. It's part of the conversation we were having earlier with fraud. And when you're parking, in other areas that aren't well lit, maybe there's no cameras or, there's no security. There's just, you're out, you're susceptible to criminal activity.
Sure.
And we get reports, from different, agencies that show us where crime is happening, what truck stops, what areas. And that's a scary thing. And that's something that we need to do a better job of. And I think that's a good start, right there, with the $200 million that's going to hopefully be allocated towards parking. But I'd like to see, that get pushed through and it actually happen. And the other thing, this is something that's, and I'm going to take this directly from John Elliott. So hello, John, if you're listening. He mentioned that, if you're a producer, you're a shipper, and you're going to have 50 trucks in there a day, you should have the facilities for them to park, because drivers on the side of the road waiting to get, there's a video, there's an incident that happened in Chicago about 2 weeks ago where there were trucks parked, outside of a facility.
Sure.
That were all broken into, and literally I don't know how much product was taken. I don't know all the details, but the criminals were very brazen, and that's where it is today. And you have to protect yourself, and we have to protect our drivers and provide them a safe environment to park, whether it be when they get their hours in at a truck stop or a rest area, or when they're actually at a shipper or a constantly waiting or, waiting to pick up or waiting to deliver. And so I think that's a bill that, we should all be watching closely and, ensuring that it does pass. And that's the least we can do for our drivers.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. The thing that I think is overlooked quite a bit is the common theme, I would say, over the last few topics we've discussed is really just how important and how paramount this over-the-road industry really is to our functionality as a society, and as to really the needs and the operational workflow of the businesses and companies that we serve. And when you look at the propensity and the likelihood that the over-the-road model will continue to grow and increase as there is failings in other areas of infrastructure or reliability, I think it's very, very important that these investments are made, because otherwise, why would someone want to go ahead and, let's say, select a career path where there's danger and where there is a lot of unknowns involved? Like, hey, you know what? Driving a truck is a great career, but it is probably going to be dark wherever you park and you might get mugged. I think that is a lot different than saying, hey, you know what? You're trusted to take this freight over the road, and there's guaranteed rest stops, and they're well lit, and there's facilities for you to use so that your drive can be as comfortable as possible. I think that's a very different sell when you're trying to get the next generation of individuals who want to go ahead and make sure that the company stays running, or the country, I should say, stays running. Yeah.
No, I think you nailed it. And I think you said it very well. I mean, the drivers are truly the backbone of our economy. And that's you might hear that once in a while, but it's an understatement. They, everything you buy, whether it be these couches, this table, these microphones, was shipped on a truck at some point over the road. And, the drivers are kind of they're not always recognized for the service they truly provide.
Yeah. No, and I agree with that especially. And there is a lot of, I guess I'll say, almost unique needs that are starting to come, whittle their way down into the industry. And we talk about the next generation coming up and the different types of certifications that drivers may have. And I had seen recently as well there's going to be some changes coming up with the way that CDL licenses are granted and the ways that they are maintained. And right now, currently, there's around 171,000 drivers that may be at risk of losing their CDL status. Now, that doesn't mean that they're all over-the-road truckers. Mm-hmm. They could have a variety of different license types. They could be driving a bunch of different vehicles. That may be, mom and pop who have a large CDL class RV that they take out a couple times a year. But at the end of the day, there's still over 170,000 drivers that may be at risk for this. So as others get themselves, I should say, into this business, into the space, there's also a lot of opportunities for growth. And one of them, I think, especially, as we mentioned with all the growth and things happening in Mexico, having that ability to be able to haul freight cross border, I think, is something that's really growing and is going to very much be an important cornerstone of our economy going forward.
Yeah, there's no. Well, Mexico is. Well, it used to be NAFTA, right? And now I think it's USMCA.
Yeah.
Is the correct acronym today. But that is, it's an integral part of what the North American economy, and it's not going away. If anything, it's just growing rapidly. The investment into Mexico, not only from a nearshoring standpoint, is having a major impact. And I look at how, like, when I look at maybe a customer bid that we've been doing for the last few years, and I see, like, in year one there were 10 lanes involving a cross-border point in Mexico, and year two it was 15 lanes, and now it's 25 lanes or maybe 30 lanes. And I was talking to one large tier one auto supplier, and I was asking them about their network, and they explained that 50% of their network now touches Mexico, meaning that every truck, every rail or intermodal has either a delivery or is shipping from a Mexico point. And that was 10 years ago was only maybe a fraction of their overall spend. So that's happening across. It's not just automotive. That's happening in any major manufacturer. If you look at, the tier one, tier two suppliers, they pretty much all have a presence in Mexico, and that's on not only, just like I said, in the automotive space, but heavy duty truck, appliances, machinery. It's across the board. If there's production involved, Mexico seems to be a very solid partner, or certainly the primary location they're looking to set up plants right now.
Yeah.
You're just going to continue to see more and more cross-border freight.
Well, and you'd think so, because really in the last 16 months, 15 of those months were new records in terms of trade volumes between Mexico and the United States. I mean, just last month, there was $73 billion in goods that were shipped from Mexico to the United States. And that's up 6.9% from year over year from the year before.
Yeah.
And those are stellar numbers, especially when you're talking about that quantity of goods. And I don't see that really stopping anytime soon. It's such a favorable environment for that to happen. And for the carriers, for the customers that have their hands and that have different logistical processes in place for where things are made and how we can get them to that endpoint. I think everybody wants to have a piece of that pie. Yeah. And especially if there are carriers out there, I guess if we can even speak to the carrier aspect of it for a second, I feel like having that fast certification to be able to have those cross-border moves is almost an integral part of future-proofing yourself to a large degree, to make sure that you can stay competitive and that you can be on top of some of the best freight in the business.
Yeah, well, that's, you need to, Mexico is such a key part of what we're doing today, and I imagine a key part of what most companies, a lot of transportation companies are looking at. How do we service Mexico? If they're getting into it just now, they might be a little late to the game, but there's still plenty to be had there. But you're looking at B1 drivers are certainly a solution that a lot of people are looking towards. Having facilities at the border to potentially our partners at the border to cross-dock freight, to transload freight, just as maybe a consolidation point as well. If you're bringing in, partials into Laredo and then up into wherever the end users are. But ultimately, I think you're going to see more and more investment going down into, certainly the border, the infrastructure at the border. I think Laredo, 80%, maybe even a higher number than that, crosses through Laredo. And the other thing that you didn't mention, I think you said 73 billion, which is insane.
With a B.
Yeah, I know. That's insane to think. But also, we're supplying some of the, the U.S., a lot of that business is going southbound, from U.S. suppliers into those assembly plants as well. Nowhere near. And I know when you're talking to carriers, there's an imbalance of, northbound to southbound freight. Obviously, if you have something going into the interior of Mexico, you're going to get a more favorable rate than coming out of. Sure. Simply from just the, supply and demand. But yeah, it's something that we are actively addressing, and we have boots on the street, boots in the interior of Mexico, developing carriers, working with our customers, and it's something that we see as a big part of our future.
Absolutely. And, going beyond just Mexico as a location, I think the whole strategy of being able to look beyond the borders of the United States goes a really long way because, again, our two closest neighbors in Mexico as well as Canada oftentimes will look into the United States for more strategic alliances, more strategic points of sale. And I would definitely encourage, obviously, anyone who's listening to this podcast to definitely go ahead and take a look at those things. For instance, we work with a lot of customers in Canada that will look to source vehicles out of the United States because there's greater selection, greater geography, and a lot of times they can get a much better deal.
Yeah.
Same thing when you look at Mexico. A lot of times there can be, from an import-export standpoint, a really good opportunity in looking in those places. But again, John, obviously you've listened to this podcast before, so you know that we're all about helping arm yourself with good questions.
Right.
But that is a really good question to ask your transport partner is, do you have carriers who are capable of being able to run freight across the border and back, or either in and out or out and in?
Yeah. Or from Mexico into Canada in bond.
Absolutely.
Right. So those are questions that you should understand from your provider, what their capabilities are, and have that full understanding before you start, the relationship, just so you don't go down that road and find out that they don't have those capabilities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and even when you look at some of the partnerships that we've built that I think are very valuable that people don't think about, import brokers, marshaling yards, being able to go ahead and have not just the driver that can cross the border, but also somewhere you can put the freight, put the vehicle until it clears customs, having the ability to send the plates, the title, the registration, all those little details that you might not think about, but that are very, very important in making sure that that vehicle ends up at its endpoint.
Yeah, no, 100%. Absolutely.
Well, John, one more topic I wanted to cover today. And again, really, really appreciate you coming on. Really appreciate your insights. I think they've been really, really good. Wanted to talk a little bit about EVs and the current market for electric vehicles. Seems to definitely be cooling off a bit, not just statistically, but also anecdotally. It definitely seems like there's fewer and fewer people out there that are interested. And it seems like a lot of the sales and production numbers are starting to back that up a little bit. What's your take on the current state of the electric vehicle market?
It's a really good question, and I feel like I get conflicting information on the state of the EV market, but certainly there has been a dip in the demand, and I don't know what's causing that. I think, I shouldn't say, I know there's been some articles that I've read that talk about concerns. I think there's people who are concerned with the range, with the infrastructure to support it, as far as the charging stations, and then, what does the maintenance look like? Because now, the last few years, I think this year they're projected to sell, I think it's 16 to 17 million EVs, globally, but over the years, this is really 5, 6 years, 7 years in, and now people are seeing it. What are the maintenance issues? Like how do these batteries need to be replaced? What are the different, things they have to address with the EV versus a combustible engine? And that's new, right? And anything new is going to take some time to adopt. But I know the recent numbers, you're seeing incentives, the government put the $7,500 incentive on, tax deferment or tax deduction on EV vehicles if purchased, which I think is going to help, prop up some sales. But ultimately, I think maybe this dip is short term. I think that we're still going to a world that's going to be predominantly either hybrids or EV vehicles, along with ICE vehicles. But I do see that there are some concerns from, folks when looking at buying an EV. I'm actually right now looking at potentially buying an EV, and it works for my situation. It works great. I live 7 miles from the office. We have a charging station right in our parking structure. So it would be an ideal solution for me. But and the other side of that, and this is something that is more impactful from the freight side, and I'm being a little selfish wanting to talk about freight, but, I have seen, with an EV vehicle, right? I believe I read there's 40% fewer parts in an EV vehicle than a combustible engine. And one thing that was amazing to me is just in the drivetrain alone, an ICE vehicle has 200 moving parts, and versus 15 to 17 parts on an EV vehicle. So obviously more parts means more suppliers that are, providing that, those parts ultimately to the to the OEM, and that is a more, there's more opportunities for, different customers to work with in that area. If we're seeing more parts, if you're consolidating the parts into, you're going to see less, less origins and delivery points.
Yeah, that's definitely a very interesting point, especially when you talk about there being fewer parts. Because theoretically, to the consumer, that should be better, less maintenance, less things to go wrong. But from a supply chain perspective, that definitely diminishes the reliance you would need on suppliers and ancillary components. It would essentially increase your quality compliance in the factory. At least you would think in theory, right? But the thing is, do all of those things match market demand? And that's what I think the real difficult thing to pinpoint is. And the reason is because there is now more data starting to come out about this. There was recently an article out of Automotive News that said as of a month or two ago, around 40% of current EV owners would prefer to purchase an ICE vehicle or an internal combustion engine vehicle as their next car purchase. They're no longer interested in an EV. You definitely see that we've kind of reached the top of the roller coaster when it comes to overall sales. That $7,500 incentive is no longer available to many manufacturers just based on overall volume. There's definitely some things out there that are starting to become almost a little bit, I don't want to say anti-EV, but it's definitely seems the narrative is shifting. And you're seeing that also in terms of some of the major announcements. General Motors made huge headlines by saying that they were going to transition their fleet to be fully electric, Cadillac specifically, by the year 2030. And now a lot of those statements are retracted, saying, well, there will be a combination of EV, hybrid, as well as ICE vehicles. And honestly, I can't blame them because you're in business to make money. And you're in business to go ahead and give consumers what they want. And if the market is telling you something and you already have, the tooling and the components and the product lineup that people are interested in currently buying,
why would you? Yeah, the consumer, give them what they want.
Yeah, it just makes me wonder. So again, for those who maybe are catching this for the first time, our office is located right outside of Detroit, Michigan. And one of the, I would say the biggest poster children for both the rise and fall of Detroit has been Michigan Central Station. And Ford Motor Company purchased the station back in 2018 to be the new autonomous driving headquarters. And that was, of course, the big buzzword that everybody had for a while. And then it was realized autonomous driving was probably never going to actually be a thing. And so now that's being repurposed as the new EV headquarters, which is good. But I say that to be essentially to state that there are major capital investments that need to be taken on by these manufacturers to be able to facilitate a full-on charge-forward EV approach.
Well, to even add more to that conversation, I read in California, this was the first quarter where registrations of EV vehicles actually dropped. So it went from 102,000 just to 101. So it actually dropped for the first time. And that's, again, I think there's challenges in the space, but I think those challenges are on the infrastructure. I do think ultimately, my children are going to be driving EV vehicles. Your children are going to be driving EV vehicles. And there might be some old, me somewhere, driving along in my ICE engine, but for the most part, it's going to be EVs. It's just it's going to happen, and that's something that we just need to plan for and need to have the infrastructure to support. And it's the pressure put on, whether it be the local municipalities to have the charging stations or whatever regulatory, things that we need to pass to push more EVs. But it'll happen. It didn't. I mean, vehicles, when, back in the early 1900s, no one thought that there was going to be a highway system. And, it was the auto clubs. It was AAA that was, putting pressure on, the U.S. government to build infrastructure. And it's going to have to go the same way here for the future of EVs. But it's part of who we will become.
Yeah, definitely not going away, but absolutely in definite need of further infrastructure investment to make it a more viable option for most people.
Well, and they're expensive.
That too.
I mean, and people don't understand what's the resale value right now. And so I think we'll start to find out what that is here shortly. And, that might help bolster sales and people realize that they can, make that investment because they are expensive. I think the average EV is probably somewhere in the 60 range when you factor in, I think, the range of all the different EVs. But, can they get their return on investment?
As of right now, currently, no. Because As of right now, 2/3 of electric vehicles that are on the resale market, and obviously remarketing is kind of my expertise here at RPM, 2/3 of them are on market for $25,000 or less, which is a pretty large depreciation hit.
Right.
And they're actually accelerating depreciation more than ICE vehicles in a lot of ways. But again, that could be bolstered by a lot of things. Obviously, it's a much more niche, much smaller pool of vehicles, less widely adopted. The infrastructure is not there yet. Definitely don't think that's going to be a permanent statistic. I definitely think that will shift and change as parts become more readily available and things like that. But I definitely think that EVs are going to serve, going forward, a very concrete portion of our population. And I think we'll definitely be here to stay for a while.
Absolutely.
Now, someone is a car nut. I don't know how much I would love driving an EV. I love the sound, the emotion.
Right.
You and I, we've spoken before. Obviously, I'm a huge racing fan.
Right.
So Aston Martin just announced that they are, the Aston Martin Valkyrie is a race car that's going to be debuting down at the Rolex 24 in January in Florida. I will be there in person to both see it and hear it. It's a 6.5 liter naturally aspirated V12 that revs to 11,000 RPMs. See, that's cool, right?
Yeah,
or,
it's pretty cool, but 0 to 60 in 2.4 or 2.5 seconds in an EV is pretty cool too.
It is. It
So,
is.
think
Doesn't
about
sound
that.
the same, but it is also
Doesn't sound the
pretty
same,
cool.
but it still gives you the same feeling.
Different strokes for different folks.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt.
Well, John, that wraps up our time for today. Thank you so much for stopping by, spending some time here on the show, and sharing your insights. It's been a lot of fun.
No, thank you very much. I've enjoyed watching it, enjoyed being part of it, and you made it very easy to be a guest, so thank you.
And thank you for tuning in at home for this episode of the RPM Rundown podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Kmita. If you liked the content today, make sure to follow us on our social channels at RPM Moves, and make sure to tune in next month where we can do this all over again. We'll see you then. Take care.